Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, depending on which time zone you are in and where you're coming to us from. My name is Dr. Mahadio Sukai. I am the Vice President, Research and International Affairs and Chief Accessibility Officer for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, or CNIB. I am a member of the Disability and Work in Canada Steering Committee, your DWC steering committee host for this session, and also by invitation of the presenters, also your moderator. I'm very pleased to be here with you this afternoon. I'm going to first of all confirm that we are all in the right place. We are here in this session to talk about stigma in the workplace. There'll be two presentations and then a conversation with you, members of the audience. The first presentation will be from Michaela Knott from CNIB Research, a member of my research team, which is actually a coincidence. I'm not moderating because she's a member of my research team. And Michaela is going to chat with you about stigma in the context of acquired brain injury in the workplace. And then Linda and Shruti from CCRW are going to talk about combating stigma. So this session is all about stigma. If you want to talk about stigma, you are absolutely in the right place. If you don't want to talk about stigma, welcome anyway. You're going to have lots of fun. This is going to be a great session. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We'll have about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session for conversation with the presenters. And at that point, and during the presentation, I would very much encourage you to put any questions that you have into the Q&A. Not into the chat, but into the Q&A, please. And as you come up with the questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. If we can resolve them by responding sort of directly via the Q&A box, we will. Otherwise, we'll hold them for conversation at the end. I will moderate the question and answer, and I'm happy to read Q&A that pops up in the chat for our presenters. I'm also quite happy for Samira, who is the host for this meeting along with me, to upgrade someone from audience to panelist so that you can unmute and put your camera on and ask the question yourself. And so that'll come in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the session. At 3:25, I'll do a short closing for the day and say until next time when we get back together on day 3 next week. Until then, I think we've got a really good session planned for you. I'm very pleased to turn it over to Michaela, who is, as I say, a researcher on the CNIB research team, and she's going to chat with you about some of the work that's been conducted on the Accessibility Standards Canada funded Inclusive Workplaces project that CNIB Research has. So Michaela, I'm going to turn it over to you and enjoy the session, everybody.
Thank you, Mahadio. So as Mahadio mentioned, my name is Michaela Knott, and I'm actually here delivering the presentation on behalf of a really wonderful team who includes Alexa Dallaire, who was the primary lead on the research project, Ainsley Latour, who is also a researcher with the team, and as well with Dr. Mahadio Sukai. So just to give a little bit of an overview, we're doing a bit of an overview of a research project, and we've titled it Looking at Mediating Stigma at Work. To give the overview of the presentation, so in terms of defining acquired brain injury, then looking at the key concepts and definitions, presenting the research question and methods, examples of the conceptual model, and then looking at the impacts in the workplace, and then some key takeaway messages from what we've seen. So what is brain injury? So brain injury and acquired brain injury can include stroke, concussion, a brain tumor, hydrocephalus, and even intimate partner violence. So the kind of two primary categories are traumatic and non-traumatic brain injury. So traumatic brain injury is expected to be coming in terms of the leading cause of disability in Canada with Alzheimer's, dementia, and epilepsy by 2030. This is from the Brain Injury Canada website. And traumatic brain injury occurs as a result of an exceptional force on the body, external force on the body, so such as a fall, a blast, a motor vehicle accident. And an interesting fact is that 1/3 of survivors of TBI, which is the traumatic brain injury in Canada, are women. So acquired brain injury is sustained after birth. It is not related to a congenital or a degenerative disease or condition. And each person's experience of a brain injury and recovery is different. So an ABI, an acquired brain injury, can impact all dimensions of an individual's life, and this includes behavior, cognition, emotional, and physical capabilities. So when we're looking at disability, stigma, and acquired brain injury, from the literature, we describe a kind of few examples and in terms of stigma in the workplace for adults with ABI. Stigma can manifest as discriminatory experiences such as bullying, exclusion, denial of accommodations, and also denial of opportunities. However, there is little examination of the impacts of stigma on an individual's career path and then perceptions of one's own abilities. The research question and methods that we are looking at is how does stigma in the workplace influence self-efficacy and career trajectories of adults with ABI in Canada? The methods and participants included one-to-one semi-structured interviews that were averaging 15 minutes in length. We had 22 participants and 15 female, 6 male, and 1 person identified as gender fluid. Individuals were between the ages of 18 to 54 years of age and older, and the age of onset of an acquired brain injury was between 12 years of age to 52 years of age. And 55% of participants identified as they're having an ABI that related to concussion. Excuse me. So stigma, when we look at the terminology, Goffman identified it kind of a term from Greek, looking kind of at the physical mark that's burned into the flesh to indicate a certain group of individuals. So it's that kind of symbolic representation from kind of a historical perspective. It's an attribute that elicits widespread disapproval and disgust or fear, and describes social differences that are devalued or considered, in terms of Goffman's approach, a bit of a spoiled social identity. There's also a focus on the recognition of difference and devaluation of that difference, and occurs in social interaction, not necessarily residing in a person, but in a social context of social interaction. So then we turn to the process of stigmatization, and this can be both overt or subtle, and occurs both at the societal, interpersonal, and also individual levels. It functions to maintain inequalities between social groups, such as exploitation or domination, to enforce social norms, and also social inclusion, which we can kind of easily experience in terms of the language that we've had around COVID and stigmatization, in terms of isolation and disease. So when we talk about overt stigma, so this can be evidenced by avoidance and aversion to interactions, social rejection, discounting, discrediting, dehumanization, depersonalization, and into stereotypical caricatures. When we look at subtle stigmatization, it includes nonverbal interactions and expressions of discontent. This can include tense or kind of in terms of social, includes tense social situations or social encounters. So looking at the conceptual framework that we found interesting here, it comes from Pryor, Reeder, and Landau, and it includes kind of 4 interconnected components with public stigma, self-stigma, a stigma by association, and structural stigma. Public stigma at the center of the pyramid cycle influences structural stigma at the top and stigma by association and self-stigma at the bottom. So if you imagine a triangle, structural stigma is at the top, and then kind of the 2 bottom corners are self-stigma and stigma by association, with public stigma kind of at the heart of this pyramid, and they're all interconnected, influencing each other. So structural stigma addresses the historical and cultural context of stigmatization. It is also how institutions legitimize stigma and social inequalities, and addresses the social ideologies and institutions that pattern inequalities and the dissemination of power and hegemony. So looking at the ways individuals and groups of individuals can be dominated. It is embedded in local knowledge structures and ways of knowing. So how this is important to the project is that it relates to the workplace accommodation processes, and that 82% of participants did disclose their ABI to a supervisor, while 18% did not disclose in the context of a workplace. Other examples of structural stigma looks around anti-discrimination laws and complaint processes in terms of the mechanisms of enforcement, and also how in terms of tolerance. When we look at public stigma, so this includes both cognitive, affective, and behavioral reactions to stigma and stigmatization. And this can include related to the perceiver of the stigma or a condition of stigma. So it's the public attitude, in terms of consensus that an attribute is a social disadvantage or is devalued. So this is at the core of the framework in terms of the manifestations of stigma. So when we look at how it kind of emerges in terms of manifestation, so this participants noted that it emerges in terms of comments from supervisors, particularly related to the trust. So a manager not being able to trust an employee, or else the supervisor saying, to other colleagues that one has to be careful around a survivor of acquired brain injury in terms of the workplace. It also leads to perceptions of being perceived as being difficult or a burden in the workplace. And also participants would mention that it depends on whether people kind of, here in quotations, kind of get it. And it also too impacted their own trust of future employers and coworkers to be able to understand and empathize. So they also kind of discuss in terms of public stigma, colleagues overestimating one's abilities at work and not understanding the effort and time needed that individuals needed to complete their work that they would do kind of in terms of like the hidden labor. When talking about stigma by association, this is the extension of stigmatization by association. So in terms of family, friends, and other individuals, and then the attributions because of closeness. At the work, this includes related to social isolation and also works in terms of social interactions. So here in this context, what participants mentioned is social interactions being mediated by the supervisor, or if interacting with new colleagues that a supervisor say even someone cannot be trusted. So in terms of the close connections, these were kind of connected in terms of some stigma by association. When looking at self-stigma, this is experienced or anticipated stigma. Also includes stigma consciousness. So this is the focus on an individual's ability to identify stigma. It can be enacted, felt, or internalized stigma that operates at the self. Participants mentioned overcompensating, fear of being treated differently in terms of keeping it secret in quotations for years, feeling of having to prove oneself, being also hard on oneself, also making sure to, quote, keep up to the workloads and with other colleagues. It's identified in the literature kind of two ways of interacting around self-stigma. One is problem-based coping strategies. And the focus here is on individual and environment for coping strategies. Here, what participants mentioned is looking at self-employment, finding a new employer, also in terms of kind of mediating disclosure. From an emotional focused coping strategies, this relates to kind of the regulating the negative emotions. So some of this can include positive identity affirmation and social comparison. Participants may mention having to reframe one's work priorities and focus, especially focusing on one's health and well-being. In the concept of self-stigma, this is the one area where participants were much more could easily identify self-stigma, but also in terms of looking at kind of the subtle and the covert. This is one of those elements where the participants were clearly identified in terms of looking at their kind of own experiences, but participants generally did have a hard time identifying kind of the larger processes of stigma. So what are the impacts of stigma in the workplace? So this includes willingness to disclose to an employer, a supervisor, or fellow colleagues. It also relates to mistrust towards future and potential employers and workplace accommodation processes. It also relates to social inclusion and isolation from work activities and fellow colleagues. It also incorporates hidden labor in the workplace, masking one's disability. It's also, there's an impact on self-efficacy and certainty in one's future trajectory or future career. And it's also an increase in terms of interest in self-employment or self-defining work arrangements. Some of the key takeaways that can be identified in terms of the identification of different forms of stigma is not easily communicated or identifiable, especially covert and subtle forms of stigmatization. Self-stigma is more readily identifiable for many individuals with ABI, impacting self-efficacy and career trajectories, but also related to the different type of coping strategies individuals are able to undertake. Employers, managers, and coworkers do not have sufficient understanding of acquired brain injury, leading to mistrust and multiple barriers in the workplace. And as well, the majority of participants were able to return to their existing employment with some modification. However, a small minority returned to the same work without any type of modification. Nearly 20% of adults with working age with ABI in the study are not willing to disclose in the context of work. And nearly 25% of individuals prefer seeking full-time self-employment opportunities or future employment for control over the work schedule and for more flexible work arrangements. And finally, looking at the future directions in terms of next steps and research processes, there needs to be more work related to specific occupations and industries, taking a more gendered lens towards stigma and the impacts of stigma consciousness on self-efficacy, as well as looking at the quality of working environment for individuals with acquired brain injury. So those were kind of some of the key findings that we have from the project. And I would like to just hand it over to the next segment to Linda and Shruti for their presentation. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michaela. Excellent presentation. And I really appreciate how the nuanced understanding of stigmatization is so critical for us to impact actions against that stigma. Hello, everybody. This is Linda speaking.
Linda, sorry, it's Mahadio. I'm just going to interrupt for a moment. Your PowerPoint captioning is on, but then we also have captioning for the session, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay.
And the two may actually overlap each other. So
I think I just turned it off. Is that better?
Good. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much for letting me know. Okay, so my name is Linda. My pronouns are they and she. I'm an e-learning and curriculum developer at the Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, or CCRW. I am a femme-presenting white individual wearing a black and white striped blouse, and I have black rimmed glasses. I'll hand it to you, Shruti.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Linda, for introducing this. My name is Shruti Goenka, and I am the Director of Finance at the Canadian Council of Rehabilitation and Work. My pronouns are she and her. I am of South Asian descent, and I'm wearing a pink shirt with a black jacket, and my hair is downwards. Over to you, Linda.
Thank you. So as we all know, and as Michaela told us about a little earlier, stigmatization of people with disabilities in many facets of society, especially in employment, is a huge barrier to true inclusion in many organizations. The misinformed attitudes towards people with disabilities amplifies barriers to work by prejudging, by siloing and pigeonholing. It also creates social environments for employees with disabilities that can be quite hostile, therefore contributing to low retention and promotion rates. And I mean, those are just a few factors. So today we're going to talk about the universal design for strength-based disability inclusion. And I'll tell you a little bit about why we've chosen to talk about this design. Universal design considers a multidisciplinary lens, including disability, from a systemic perspective, and considers many stakeholders within the design, planning, structuring, and utilization of systems. And so whether these systems exist in educational institutions, places of work, or in our communities, when we apply the universal design, we're thinking about how to include as many people as possible from the beginning.
Linda, sorry, it's Mahadio again.
Yeah.
Just a reminder to be mindful of your pace for captioning in ASL.
Certainly, thank you. Universal design promotes multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. These principles can be applied at both systemic and individual levels and everywhere in between. An optimistic pathway ahead to a fully inclusive workforce is via universal design. It's a great way for businesses, organizations, and the community to invest and commit to true inclusive practices and spaces. Universal design works to normalize or to destigmatize disability by prioritizing disability and inclusion as much as non-disability at the systemic level. And so you may be thinking, I'm not creating a system from scratch. My organization structures already exist, as many of ours do. Inclusion is a continual process of actions each day, as many of us know. And you can easily start by initiating a critical review of your internal systems, which considers both visible and invisible disabilities.
To continue from there, when we came together as a team to brainstorm about the theme of beyond accommodations, there was one persistent reality that kept coming up. The first door that we kept repeatedly knocking on was combating disability stigma. Without a shift in attitudes and beliefs about disabled people and disabled employees, efforts to increase inclusion beyond accommodations will fall flat. But since creating a paradigm shift in all of society is a massive undertaking, we started to dig in further to unpack how institutions and organizations can be leaders and change agents in combating disability stigma. It came down to three main areas on how universal design can work to inform these areas and elevate them into a place of disability confidence and inclusion. The three areas that we kept running into were organizational culture, human resource practices, and policies and procedures. It's certainly not surprising that disability inclusion involves in-depth consideration of all the moving parts of an organization, from the social environment to the job description, the compensation, as well as the policies and procedures that guide people. Still, we see businesses being reactive instead of proactive and act on inclusion only when it is mandated. So we will now share some system-level strategies to enhance each of these areas through a multi-disability universal approach and spark an inspiration for how you can advocate for universal design in your own context and shift from reactive disability inclusion to holistic disability integration. Next slide, please.
Linda speaking again. So a healthy and inclusive culture is intentional. It is strategic and it is socially informed. The culture of an organization should be one that thinks of inclusion as a core component and not just a task to be completed. Inclusion is not a placeholder, but a manner of operation to gain the most out of a diverse pool of talent available in the workforce. One does not need to build a business case for hiring a person with disabilities, just the way that one does not need a business case for hiring Canadians. Some people are skilled, some are not, some are suitable for some jobs, some are not. It's about creating an environment where diversity of thought as well as diversity of experience are valued, celebrated, and utilized. Inclusive workplace culture is an environment that values, appreciates, and welcomes employees of all backgrounds and diverse characteristics. And so we want to provide some practical examples on how to implement the principles of universal design when it comes to culture. So one could be engaging in workforce culture building activities that are diverse, dynamic, and recruit different interests. For example, don't just stick with the same types of activities or events, switch it up and try to change the models, change the methods to include as many people as you can. Provide learning opportunities that allow staff to have more individual choice and autonomy in their own learning. So how the content is learned, what methods it is used to learn, what types of incentives or rewards are given for those tasks, the tools used, etc. Another way is to provide multiple options for staff to stay motivated. Some people work well with guides and checklists and focus on self-regulatory goals. Some people do well with mentors and coaches. Some people do well with a blend, and that will ebb and flow and be fluid over the course of their employment. So really, it's just about being flexible and malleable to adapt to meet the strengths of the workforce, as opposed to having individual talent kind of restricted in a box. Ensure, obviously, that gathering spaces, offices, and workstations are accessible, not just to folks with physical disabilities, but for a wide variety of differences, sensory issues, auditory, text-based, and things like that. And also to promote understanding across languages. And the last point here is to use multiple means of communication. So instead of just using email for your main source of communication, switch it up a bit, have text-based, maybe there's video conferencing, have face-to-face group discussions, and ensure when you choose a method that you're always providing alternatives for the individuals to contribute.
Again, this is Shruti speaking. Again, a collaborative environment of belonging, openness, and respect can go a long way in enhancing inclusion. The goal of universal design is about creating an inclusive workplace where people feel welcome and comfortable and where they are seen and valued and appreciated for what they bring to the table. There are some practical examples of how an organization can go about creating a collaborative environment. For example, encouraging openness around challenging the status quo. Don't continue to do what has been done just because that's the way things have been. You never know why something started and where it might lead. The context might have changed, the technology might have changed. So being open to challenging the status quo is something to be encouraged and not to be frowned upon. Again, facilitating cross-team building opportunities. So many times people get pigeonholed into doing the same job and meeting and working with the same people in the company. But there might be areas there where one's strengths might be enhanced and identified if there were opportunities to do cross-functional roles. So facilitating that cross-team building opportunity is something that could enhance inclusion in an organization. Friendliness, a sense of humor, and transparency from the executive team helps reinforce the people-first tone. We cannot stress enough about the importance of this. When a message comes from the top of the organization, it carries that much more weight. It forces people to believe that the organization is serious about taking inclusion to the next level. Contributing to a culture of collaboration instead of competition, so that staff view each other as allies and not as competitors. Again, that's something that could create a much more collaborative environment at work. There are many other such examples. We have included them on our tip sheet and our takeaway material, and it might be a good idea to refer to them. And then moving on, there is the next bit about an organizational culture is the communication bit. Adapting and empowering communication style, the mode, tone, and frequency of communication and connection is a subtle but important part of increasing organizational inclusion. Language matters. Ensuring that our language is inclusive and respectful matters. Language influences attitudes, and attitudes influence culture. Replacing and reinventing the traditional label of this is a client with this is a person with potential, talent, and skills is not only inclusive, but it's also a smarter way of conducting business. Strength-based interactions. Changing the attitude towards disability also includes recognizing individual strengths, skill sets, and competencies. Very often, a person with a disability may have unique, novel, and innovative ways of creative thinking, problem solving, overcoming challenges. Disability is not something that should be ignored or avoided. In fact, recognizing the strengths and assets that people with disabilities bring just because of their experiences in navigating the world as a disabled person, help us destigmatize disability, enhance inclusive workplaces, and bring diverse perspectives and ideas that enrich teams and business practices. Again, there are certain questions that one can keep in mind as you think about implementing the principles of universal design into your communication strategies. Think about, is my communication clear? Is it direct and available in a variety of formats? Is my communication accessible to screen readers and keyboard navigation? Does my communication include inclusive, morally neutral, and non-judgmental language? Again, there are further questions that one should be mindful of while designing communication strategy, and we've included those on our takeaway material. Linda, next slide, please.
Thank you. Linda speaking again. Inclusion is a component of an intentional organizational strategy. Applying the principles of universal design in HR practices helps to cultivate a culture of inclusion. These practices should be integrated within all organizational processes and woven into the very fabric of HR operations. So how can HR systems be universally designed? Well, there's no one-size-fits-all formula. However, a holistic approach where inclusion is everyone's responsibility will take an organization further on the road to an inclusive workplace. We will look at these a little more closely. So, universally designed HR practices best serve to enhance the inclusion of people with disabilities only when there is ample executive support. And that has to be publicized and promoted and is consistently made a priority by the executive team. And this can range from routine disability confidence upskilling, which we have a lot of at CCRW, to supporting disability-related initiatives and beyond. Leaders have the ability to amplify visibility in the workplace and ensure representation and empower inclusion at every level of the organization. Ensuring the interpersonal environment is inclusive of people with disabilities is another important HR consideration. So what training do staff need to have a strong baseline of knowledge about disabilities? How can inclusion be integrated throughout staff onboarding and orientation? What mechanisms can you set up to ensure that people with disabilities can voice their concerns to the appropriate channels if the need arises? The answers to these questions will look different depending on your industry, your demographics, and your location, but they're definitely important to consider. Another important HR consideration is to consistently empower people with disabilities towards professional development opportunities and promotions. For instance, creating job descriptions and project goals and performance measures that are universally designed and disability inclusive ensures that people with disabilities have access to employment promotions and raises. Tease through your evaluation criteria and ask the question, who does this exclude? Ensure there are a variety of methods for individuals to complete a task and empower staff, and empower people to autonomously direct their workflow in a way that best suits them, with guidance, of course, and structure. And the fourth point is ensuring people with disabilities are compensated equally and include their unique disability-related assets in their compensation reviews. So if an employee with disabilities is consistently not applying for roles that you feel they would be qualified for, investigate and find out why. Perhaps your health and insurance policies need to be revisited. You can ask your insurance providers what packages they have to support people with disabilities. Maybe the benefit structures or vacations or personal days or other intangible perks could be shifted to better serve that particular individual. What flexibility could be built in to meet the dynamic needs of the inclusive workforce? What policies are creating additional barriers and only exist as legacy? So just as Shruti said earlier, challenging the status quo and getting really creative about problem solving. Human resource markers of an inclusive organization might be robust peer mentoring programs, EAP programs with an emphasis on mental health and work-life balance, inclusion initiatives like fairs or webinars, and training to keep inclusion within our immediate site at all times. And we do have some resources linked in our tip sheet that will be available for download in the conference portal.
Having looked at the first two elements of universal design, the final element of universal design are policies and procedures. Inclusion of people with disabilities into the workplace involves policies and procedures which are designed to be inclusive of a diverse array of needs, styles, and abilities. Having a core framework of disability inclusion policies can be used to articulate an organization's commitment to including people with disability and shows the practical things that an organization is willing to do to promote inclusion. This can encourage early disclosure, supportive communication around accommodations, and prevention of long-term issues arising from a lack of inclusion. So universal design can be implemented in so many areas of policies and procedures. You could look at recruitment and hiring. You could look at training and upskilling, operations and job duties, reporting and dispute mediation. So the benefits of universally designed policies is that the impact can be realized by a diverse array of employees. It is not limited to people with disabilities. A diverse policy which is inclusive is helpful for both disabled and non-disabled employees. Such policies must be clear, they must be direct, they must be transparent, and more than anything, they need to be co-constructed in partnership with subject matter experts within the disability community. They may be revisited, reviewed, critiqued, and amended periodically because language, social awareness, and the approach, it grows, it evolves, and it changes over a period of time with respect to the environment, the external environmental factors and the internal culture of the company. So, that kind of brings us together to thinking about moving beyond accommodations into a true systemic inclusion. So, having true systemic inclusion requires the coordination of organizational culture, practices, policies, and all of them need to be scrutinized and redeveloped through the lens of universal design. They are things that go hand in hand. We cannot look at any of these in isolation and have a truly inclusive design of taking the organization to the next level. So that is the kind of thing we wanted to share with you today. I hope that, between the three of us, we have added value and created, made you think more about the various stigma that we all face at work with respect to disability. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please, there is a toolkit with tips and sheets with tips and tricks that you might want to take away with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Shruti. Thank you, Michaela.